Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Polis Project Digital Book Salon. My name is Michael Busch, and I am the Director of Public Programs for the Polis Project. Today, we're pleased to be talking with Ben Tippet about his new book, Split: Class Divides Uncovered, which has just been published by Pluto Press. More on that in just a minute, but before we get started, a brief note of housekeeping. We are going to try to simulate an actual book event, which means that to the extent possible, we're trying to make this an interactive event with our audience. If you have a question for Ben, please send it along to the Polis Project Twitter account, which can be found at project_Polis, and we will ask it if we have time permitting. Let's get started. I am pleased to introduce our guest this afternoon, Ben Tippet, who is an educator, an activist, and a writer. He's also currently pursuing a doctoral degree at the University of Greenwich, researching the causes of wealth inequality in the United Kingdom. He also spent some time as a researcher with the Transnational Institute, and we're really pleased to have you join us today, Ben. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Michael, for inviting me.
Absolutely. Let's jump right in. You open your book by introducing the notion of class as being something that has retreated in the popular imagination, and indeed that this is in fact a function of neoliberalism and its success. I'm wondering if you can start by just sort of talking a little bit more about that, what you mean and why you know it to be the case.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I do think that generally there is this attitude that class doesn't really matter anymore for our politics. And I think, part of the reason for this is the fact that what we've seen over the last 40 years is the kind of terminal decline, it feels like, in the organised labour movement. So, in the UK, for example, one of the kind of best indicators, I guess, for organised working class power is the statistic of the trade union density. How many trade union members there are as a proportion of the total labour force. And in the UK, since about the mid-80s to today, we've seen nearly a halving of the number of people who are or a halving of the trade union density rate. And I think the statistics in the US are something similar, although it's I think it starts at a lower threshold. I think in the UK it's gone from roughly around 45% to kind of 23% of the labour market. And so people don't really see, I guess, that type of clear kind of organised working class politics in the economy and on their screens or in their various parliaments or centres of political power. And I think in a way that has kind of led maybe people to think that class no longer shapes the global economy and no longer is something that doesn't really feel particularly relevant anymore. And I think that's kind of backed up again with a lot of the kind of symbols of class, particularly when you're coming from like a British perspective, where class is seen as this kind of old thing kind of connected to our Victorian pasts, and there's loads of kind of period dramas and stuff around class. Something that's kind of about the kind of Dickensian workhouses, but not something about the global economy. But I think actually, the point I guess I want to make in the book is the fact that just because the fact that the organised working class has declined, their power seems to have declined, doesn't mean that class has gone away. In a way, it actually symbolises that class may be becoming even more important for our politics. And this is because kind of class is it's a relational thing. It's a little bit like a seesaw. As the power of labour declines on one side of the seesaw, the power of the capitalist class, the other side of the seesaw is increasing. And who is on the other side of the seesaw? I would say it's what you would call the capitalist class. So the class narrative that I'm using in the book is the divide between capital and labour. Or I think kind of a neat way of summarising it is a quote from Warren Buffett, the third richest man in the world, who said, between the people that work till they die and those that make money while they sleep. So how do you make money while you sleep? Well, you make money by owning assets in the economy, and those assets can give you an income, whether those are financial assets or business assets or housing assets. So, in relation to your question, then, what we've clearly seen is this huge redistribution of wealth and power along this class line from labour to capital. To give you some statistics on that, in the UK, we've just lived through 12 years of kind of secular stagnation to an extent. Wage growth has completely stagnated. One of the lines that you hear repeated on the press is that this was the longest period of wage stagnation in the UK since the Napoleonic Wars. And it was actually, I was looking at the statistics on this, when was it that average wages actually only returned back to their pre-2008 level? It was actually only 2 months ago in February. And now we're obviously going into another crisis. So we're looking at potentially another 10, 12 years of no wage growth. So this is throughout the whole of my adult life, so far throughout the whole of my adult life, and it's now looking like for potentially another 15, 20 years, we might see no wage growth. When you compare that then to what's happening at the top of the distribution, to the very richest, you're seeing extraordinary fortunes being accumulated. I know in the US this was maybe a little. I think Bernie Sanders' line was the top 3 billionaires own own the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the American population. So wealth inequality is extreme. It's extreme in the US, and it's also, it's also pretty bad here in the UK. During the first 7 years from after the financial crisis to around 2017, as wages were stagnating, the richest 1,000 families in the UK doubled their wealth. So, money is being produced, wealth is being produced, it's just going to those at the top of the distribution. So this is what I'm saying by class hasn't gone away. There has been a big redistribution of wealth and power. Now, to get to your question, how does this relate to this idea that class no longer matters? Why is it that at the same time that you've seen this huge redistribution, have we kind of stopped talking about class? And I think it's partly because of the fact that ideology and the ideologies around class have, played a very important role in this redistribution. And I guess one of the central, what do I mean by ideology? I guess kind of the narratives that we, that kind of persist in society, the kind of the things that we take as kind of given and normal. And I think one of those assumptions that everyone has accepted over the last 40 years is the idea that economics now, it isn't really about class power. It's about individual competition. In order for you to succeed in the economy, you kind of need to be an individual that has to be talented or have a particular type of skill, and you'll be remunerated for your talents and your skills. And those at the top are effectively the people who are the most individually successful. They're the ones with the most individual talents. While the idea that those people at the top might be there because of kind of some kind of class power has completely gone out of our radar. And I think in a way the idea that class no longer matters and everything's about individual competition, this is the kind of narrative that has allowed the wealth to be accumulated at the top. In the book I try and kind of talk about these things because my background's in economics, but people don't necessarily want to read economic reports. You need to think of a way of how to kind of talk about this in a way that might be engaging for people, and I try and use references from films. So there's a really great film that came out in 2017 called Get Out, which I'm sure people have seen. It was an Oscar-winning horror documentary. It's an Oscar-winning horror film, and basically the film. I'm gonna do a spoiler alert now. Okay, so I'm gonna give away a little bit of the film. So if you haven't watched it, maybe skip the next 3 minutes and come back. The film is a kind of chilling satire of this the kind of underlying racism in a supposedly kind of colorblind liberal America. And what happens is a kind of multiracial couple, a white woman and a black man. The white woman says to the black man, oh, come. His name's Chris, and the girlfriend's called Rose. Rose says, oh, why didn't you come to stay for a weekend with my parents out in the countryside? And so they leave New York. Chris is a little bit worried. He's kind of saying, but did your parents know that I'm black? And Rose is like, oh, don't worry about that. Race isn't an issue here. Race isn't an issue. We don't see race anymore. And then kind of as the film develops, you start to realize that this kind of narrative that race no longer exists, and people, it doesn't really matter anymore as a relationship between these people, is actually being used as a kind of trap to ensnare Chris into the family, and in the end is kind of to kind of individualize him and to kind of give it away. They kind of hypnotize him, and they like lobotomize him and turn him into one of their servants. And I thought that was actually, if you replace race with class, I think a similar thing is happening under neoliberalism. Elites are using this narrative that class no longer matters as a way to kind of individualize, and I guess to kind of bring the metaphor to its final conclusion, to lobotomize the kind of working classes, to make them effectively work in menial jobs that they don't want to do.
Right. And so I want to focus for just a moment on sort of the top of this pyramid that you've sort of erected around class society. And you talked a little bit about how class and elites function in Great Britain, but you also mentioned Warren Buffett, who many Americans here are certainly familiar with. And in the book, you spend a little bit of time talking about this question of how Buffett sort of has produced and consolidated his own capital base, and a lot of that has come through his relationship with Coca-Cola, which has a checkered past. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the connection between profit, specifically Coca-Cola's profit, under sort of Buffett's leadership as the majority stakeholder and shareholder in Coca-Cola, and human rights abuses during that time, and sort of elaborate out the connections between the two of those things.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of use Warren Buffett a lot in the book because he's an interesting character. Because on the one hand, a lot of the time when people criticize the rich or the wealthy along class lines, they often pick out the kind of worst examples of the billionaire list. Kind of, I don't know, drug cartel lords, or people who kind of trade in war and arms deals and stuff, or those who like very explicitly kind of ride off the state. The interesting thing about Warren Buffett is that he's kind of seen as the legitimate face of capitalism, and not for like sometimes without good reason. I mean, he's a very interesting guy. He's the third richest man in the world, but he hasn't moved house since the 1950s. He doesn't have an office in New York. He has an office in Omaha, which has given him the name. I think the name he's given is the Oracle of Omaha. He talks regularly about the fact that the U.S. tax system is just chronically unjust. I think he has this line where he says, as a proportion of the income that I earn, I actually pay a lesser rate of tax than my cleaner does. So in a way, he kind of presents this. Oh, and the last point, I guess the most fundamental, is that he's pledged to give away 99% of his wealth. So I think so far he's given away $46 billion, which makes him one of the biggest philanthropists in the history of humanity. So in a way, he's an interesting guy. So I think relating to your question, the question, where did he get all this wealth in the first place? This is really the fundamental point. Like, he's the legitimate face of capitalism. How does capitalism supposedly legitimately provide wealth, fortunes for the fortunate? Mm-hmm. And so Warren Buffett is a financier, like most financial investors make up the largest proportion of billionaires in the world. So he's kind of he's a stereotype, let's say, for his class. And the way he makes money is kind of relatively simple. He picks out companies that he thinks is going to be successful, and he buys their stock and he holds it over a long period of time. And as you say, he became I think the largest shareholder in Coca-Cola in I think the late 80s, 88 or 89. He put $1 billion into it, and since then he's always been the largest shareholder in Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola has always been, I think, in the top 3 of his investment portfolio. So the company is like very much entwined with his wealth as a person, and he even supposedly drinks 4 Coca-Colas a day. There's some kind of hilarious videos of him like at the kind of shareholder meetings and stuff, like cracking open a can of Coke, like this is the American way or whatever. How does Coke? If Coca-Cola has been the kind of prime investment in his portfolio, the question is then how does Coca-Cola make its money? And there's a story, I guess, from the 90s that people might be familiar with, which starts in Colombia. So, across the world, really, Coca-Cola is infamous for trampling on workers' rights. And this particular notorious scandal that happened in Colombia occurred in 1996. It was during the Colombian Civil War. There were lots of murders going on, and particular union officials and union members who were working in one of the bottling plants of Coca-Cola were targeted by paramilitary troops, and the head union president, a man called Isidro Gil, was assassinated. Now, in a way, what kind of happened afterwards is that in response, the workers at this plant actually managed to organize a huge international campaign that really put Coca-Cola in both the metaphorical put Coca-Cola on a metaphorical trial, but also on actually a literal trial. They managed to get Coca-Cola throughout the noughties to be banned across many university campuses across the world. And I think it was the Pittsburgh Steel Workers Union, or one of the Pittsburgh unions, actually took a case against Coca-Cola, a legal case. Now, I'm not saying in a way Coca-Cola makes its money by murdering its employees every day, but within this court case, actually, it kind of exposed how Coca-Cola did really make its money. And one of the prime ways in which it tried to defend itself was to say, we don't actually have anything to do with these bottling plants all over the world. What we do is we kind of we buy it from these subcontractors. We don't really know what's going on over there. We kind of stick a label on it, and it gets sold. We just sell the rights to the brand. And this outsourcing of production is something that we've seen across multinational corporations, the richest multinational corporations across the world. I kind of call it the "it's not my business" way of doing business. And it's all about basically, you're allowed to kind of accumulate money, but as soon as something happens within the supply chain that undermines rights or that leads to kind of tragedy like the death of Isidro Gil, Coca-Cola can stand back and say it's not really anything to do with me. And this outsourcing isn't just something that's happening between multinational corporations in the global north and countries in the global south. It's also happening within our economies in Europe and also in America. So that really that outsourcing has been a prime way in which these corporations have been able to kind of accumulate profit while undermining rights without getting the kind of flack that they would have if these people were direct employees of them. And in the book I have a long list of 25 years on from what happened in the 90s in Colombia. Just across the whole world, Coca-Cola is still trampling on workers' rights. I can give you some examples. In Ireland, a couple of years ago, they refused to recognise their bottlers' union and have threatened to close the plant if their workers organise. Similar things happening in Haiti and the Philippines and in Indonesia. So that's one of the kind of real prime ways that Coca-Cola have done it. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's also the question of what Coca-Cola does with its profits when it generates them, right? And Coca-Cola is famous for sort of having a tax haven habit. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the ways in which Coca-Cola goes about managing its money in tax havens and what the implications are for the countries where it actually does business.
Yeah, this was one of the things. So it's not. I mean, in a way, Coca-Cola has another way in which it's made its profits is by effectively allowing the taxpayer to build a lot of the systems on which it relies. From the original kind of Coke fountains in the US, which are all funded by the local municipal water systems, to the local water systems that are exist in the bottling plants across the world. Coca-Cola is completely ubiquitous. It's in every country formally in the world apart from two, which I wonder if people can guess them. I mean, I'll say them, but it's North Korea and Cuba, and basically in those two places you can still get Coca-Cola. So in everywhere that it is, it's relying on systems that the government are building in order for its supply chains to actually be effective. Now, in a way, that wouldn't be a problem if it paid its taxes. But as you say, one of the key things that it does with its profits is it funnels it away in kind of the treasure islands of the world, the financial economy today. Let me just quickly adjust my mic. Is that better?
I think it sounds good.
Cool. So yeah, in a way, I mean, how does Coca-Cola actually avoid tax? There's obviously lots of different ways that multinational corporations avoid tax, but one of the key ways is actually it's relatively simple as a concept. It's called this idea of transfer mispricing. So imagine a company like Coca-Cola. It has a headquarters in America, but it will have lots of different subsidiaries across the world. So it might have a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands, let's say. Now, a lot of these different subsidiaries will buy and sell effectively products to itself, and in a way that's not necessarily a problem. This is kind of called transfer pricing, and if it's done legitimately, it's actually a kind of a normal part of the functioning of a global economy. If the subsidiary in the Cayman Islands wants to buy the rights to the brand from the parent company in Coca-Cola, that would show up as an international transfer of money. But what transfer mispricing does is it effectively uses these international flows to basically say, okay, I'll buy the brand for Coca-Cola from the parent company, and actually what the parent company will do is charge a huge amount for the brand as a way to effectively get the money out of America and into the Cayman Islands. The reason why people can't necessarily pick this up so easily is to do with the fact that actually most global trade occurs within multinational corporations rather than between corporations. So in a way, there's a huge amount of economic activity here that makes it easy for people to hide stuff. And really, since Warren Buffett took over Coca-Cola in the 1980s, it has become prolific at this type of tax evasion. I think it's accumulated something like £33 billion in tax havens across the world. So almost kind of the same amount that Warren Buffett has given away to charity, if you want to think about it like that. And this has led to the loss of billions in tax revenues from countries across the world. There's a report from the IMF, I think, which puts the figure of lost tax revenues by tax havens. So, let me repeat that. There's a report by the IMF that puts the lost revenues that governments could make at $500 billion a year. $500 billion a year is a huge chunk of money that could be used to deal with many of the social problems that exist across the world. I give some costings from how much it would pay to improve access to clean water, to deal with major infectious diseases like HIV, and $500 billion a year would go a huge way to dealing with much of these things that are kind of embedded within the Sustainable Development Goals. So I guess this raises the question, which is, does the question we've kind of looked at, I guess, is like, how do the wealthy get rich? And we've looked at the legitimate face of that. And the legitimate face of that are using all of these methods: tax evasion, outsourcing, undermining workers' rights. And in a way, this is the kind of class system, I say, working as it's supposed to. This is kind of, Coca-Cola isn't really unique in this respect. It's not the worst offender when it comes to tax evasion, let's say. It's just kind of doing what all the other companies do.
So sorry to interject, but we have a question from the audience, actually. With all of this in mind, and kind of the ways in which the global elite operate in world affairs, is it possible to we hear the slogan, abolish billionaires? Is that something that's possible? And if so, what does it look like, or what could it look like?
Yeah, the abolish. I think I like the line, "Every billionaire is a policy failure," which I think is kind of a nice way to think about it. And you see the rounds. You see these statistics going around on Twitter and stuff quite a lot, where it says, if somebody like Jeff Bezos or Warren Buffett earned, like, I don't know, £1,000 a day from when Christ was born to today, they still wouldn't have as much wealth as they do now. So the scale of the fortunes that have been accumulated are just so unbelievably vast, they're hard to get our heads around. Now, a lot of that comes from the fact that wealth generates more wealth. This, back to Warren Buffett's idea, is the people making money while they sleep. And I think you can really start to tackle that dynamic. It's kind of an exponential dynamic in a way, by doing things like having wealth taxes above quite high thresholds, and then using that to redistribute money. But this kind of thing has to really come from the most powerful economies in the world, so places like Europe, China, and the US, for this to have an effect. Because obviously, if one country unilaterally decides to increase wealth taxes on the rich, the money's just going to flow off elsewhere into the tax havens. There's lots of interesting policy proposals about how to deal with tax havens and how to, and what kind of wealth taxes would work. That if people are interested in, I think around wealth taxes and tax havens, there's a guy called Gabriel Zucman. I don't know if people know him. He's one of Thomas Piketty's kind of group of economists. He's, I think, at Stanford now, and he does a lot of interesting work on this stuff. So if people want to look a bit more into the meat of the policy stuff, I'd look there. But there's definitely ways of dealing with this. I think it's about the political will.
Yeah. So, and at the exact same time that billionaires are continuing to produce more billions for themselves, working people are struggling to pay the rent, and this has been a huge issue, I know, all over the world, and continues to be here in New York City where I am, especially pronounced, considering the COVID crisis and just the general rise of real estate more broadly. And I'm wondering if you can sort of talk a little bit about the ways in which the real estate industry and the notion of property kind of fits into your analysis of the operations of class and class power.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think with housing, what you've seen, I'll talk a little bit from the UK perspective, but I think a lot of you see a similar thing in the US as well, which is, unless you've been kind of living under a rock, you know that there's been a housing crisis even before COVID hit. Housing is deeply unaffordable. There's been a huge rise in the numbers of people who are sleeping on the street. Generations of people now being kind of priced out of the housing market and looking at a future of simply private rental without many protections, or massive overcrowding within housing. And actually, all of those things, maybe we can kind of come and talk about that afterwards. Let me just quickly try and sort the mic out issue. Let's just do that.
Apparently we're having a couple of logistical problems with the audio feed, so we're going to try to get that back up and running.
Is that any better? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you perfectly. We'll do a quick sweep of the audience and see what happens.
Yeah, let's crack on and then we can see. We'll come maybe to the COVID stuff in a sec. This fundamental question: why is housing so unaffordable? Why is it so expensive? What you've seen in the UK, at least, is an argument put forward by politicians and by the national newspapers, which is that housing is so expensive because the economy, the country, is full up. There's just too many people in Britain today. And this really came to the forefront of politics during the Brexit campaign in 2016, where just a couple of weeks before the actual referendum, Nigel Farage, he's a kind of key Brexiter, he unveiled this big poster which had just a group of migrants crossing the borders into Europe, and it just had the word breaking point at it. So any of these arguments that say, there's too many people here, suddenly the blame gets directed at migrants. There's too many people coming into the country. But actually, when you look at actually the statistics behind what's going on, there's absolutely no evidence that what's driving house price increases is overpopulation. So from 1998 to 2008, house prices in the UK doubled. They increased by 200%. And during that period, though, for every 4 new people that were added to the British population, 3 new homes were built. So you had enough housing supply to match the increase in population. It just doesn't explain this huge increase in British house prices. So the question is, what then is, what is driving that increase in what is making everything so unaffordable? I think it's got a lot to do with actually how we understand and view housing. There's 2 different ways to think about what a house is in our society. On the one hand, a house is like a home for people. It's a place where you can go and do your homework, watch Netflix, or, well, all of us now, it's a place where we have to go into quarantine. But we also live in a system where houses are something completely different. They're also a financial asset, a way of people making money, and people storing their wealth and people getting rich. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot of ways in which a financial asset and homes just don't merge very well together. And as houses become more like a financial asset, they can become less like homes. Mm-hmm. You see this a lot in the US, I guess, after the financial crisis, where with the big foreclosure of people's homes who couldn't afford to keep up on their mortgage payments because there'd been such kind of speculative lending. Mm-hmm. That is, a bank doesn't need a house to live in. People need houses to live in. But the bank repossesses the house because it's fundamentally the priority there is it as a financial asset, and that excludes its ability to be a house. Now, this transformation hasn't happened by accident. It was very much part of the whole apparatus of the last 40 years of economic policy making. In order for financialization to take root, really the mortgage market was the kind of bedrock of that, both in the UK and in the US. Obviously with terrible consequences, as we saw in 2008 when this became a huge speculative bubble. And so there were things that had to be done in order to turn houses into a financial asset. In the UK, the clearest way of doing this was to destroy the council housing the council housing as a legitimate system of housing people. I can't remember the actual statistics, but I think something around 40% of Britons lived in council houses in the late 1970s. 40%, so nearly, a huge number of people. I think it was over 40% actually. Today it's only something like 7%. So there's been a huge decline in council houses, and that was because of a policy that Thatcher put in, which allowed people to buy their council house and basically turn those houses into the potential for a financial asset. And this became the kind of bedrock of our mortgage industry. Now, it was the biggest privatization of state assets in the UK. I think over 1 million homes were sold off, and the houses were never replaced. Now that really is that was a direct policy, a clever policy in a way, because it created a lot of conservative voters. George Osborne, who was our previous Chancellor of the Exchequer, it's for American audience actually, basically the economic minister, the guy that does the economy in the UK. We give our ministers weird names like Chancellors of the Exchequers and stuff, which maybe tells us something about class in the UK. But he said in a private meeting that was kind of on, that has now kind of been released. He said, why would we build council homes? It just creates votes for the Labour Party, for the left-wing party. So it was direct. It was a direct aspect of policy, and we're really seeing the ramifications of that now, with the fact that there's overcrowding in both the private sector and also the social housing sector in the UK is at the highest it's been in like 15, 20 years. And obviously overcrowding now in a time of a pandemic is a serious problem. And actually some research came out the other day in London that showed that the virus is spreading much quicker in areas of the city where there's serious overcrowding. We've reverted back to this kind of Dickensian, like 1900s typhoid and cholera, this idea that within the slums of London, diseases spread quicker. I mean, it's a horrible thing to be thinking about in 2020, but it's kind of what's happened, what's happened because of the financialization of our housing system. Yeah.
So we have another question from the audience, which actually dovetails with the direction I wanted to take the conversation next. And that is, in the book, you spend considerable time talking about a variety of different sort of identity categories, things like race, things like gender, sexual orientation, and the like. And so I'll ask it as a sort of a two-part question. One, can you talk a little bit more about how identity factors into all of these equations? And then the second part is the question from the audience, which is, do you believe that identity politics has been weaponized as a way to take the conversation away from the racial foundations of inequality and class divides?
Interesting, yeah. I think there's I guess the two main things to talk about here are gender and race. Why don't we start by talking about race, because maybe it talks more to that second question that you're referring to. There's this really dominant narrative in our politics today, which is kind of seeing this resurgence of a class narrative, I would say, but it's an idea of class that is deeply racialized, and it's kind of this idea that the ordinary people have been left behind by a liberal metropolitan elite that care more about their solidarities with migrants and their kind of own pretensions than they do about the interests of the kind of the ordinary person. That you see that with Trump, you see that with Bolsonaro, you see that with all of you see that with Brexit, you saw that massively in 2019 in the election that we had here, and it's become a very powerful narrative for the right in order for them to win power, and it's completely decimated, I think, left. Well, it's been a electorally successful narrative. Now, I think these questions of like the authentic, ordinary person versus a liberal metropolitan elite can very easily slide into a racialized understanding of the working class. So it's this idea that, to be the authentic working class is to be this kind of white male figure of like a kind of pre-industrial period, and it's in a way, in the book I try and ask, why is it that this has become so electorally successful? Where does the power of this narrative come from, and why does it seem to be more powerful than the kind of capital labor narrative that the left are putting forward with people like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn? And I think what we have to remember is that this idea of whiteness is not, and the idea of dividing the people in the working class along racialized lines is not something that happened and started in 2016 with Trump and Brexit. It's a very embedded part of both the history of the US and the UK. So in the book, I go back to actually the very origins of the US, and I'm sure maybe yourself and many of your listeners might be more well versed in this history than I am. But from the research that I found, Britain's first colony in the Western Hemisphere was Virginia in 1607, and actually, Virginia's famous for it. The original colony, I guess, was famous for producing tobacco and for kind of inventing slavery. And what was kind of interesting is that for the first 80 years of the colony, people were brought over from Europe and from Africa to work in the tobacco fields, but they weren't necessarily bought as slaves. They were bought as indentured servants. So they kind of had debts to pay, and they kind of could pay off their debts and potentially kind of live a free life for themselves. And also the people that lived there weren't necessarily segregated along class lines. And after kind of an uprising that happened in Jamestown, and the British colonial elites had to leave, when they came back with an army and kind of crushed the rebellion, they really decided that what they needed to do was separate and divide people. And the way that they did it was by inventing this idea of whiteness as a kind of legal category. And to be white meant that you effectively could own land, and you might be able to kind of, you could own land, and you could, you could free yourself from kind of the hardships of being an indentured servant. And the opposite of being white was obviously to be black, which was to kind of denigrate you as something to be owned, to say that you were property. And it was the invention of slavery which was very much tied to this idea of whiteness. And the British colonial elites realized that this was a very successful way of ruling over their colonial subjects, and so they reproduced this across the colonies across the world. And we see a very similar narrative playing out through the 20th century with like non-white citizens from the British Empire coming to the UK, and a way of basically the UK government ruling people. So I think the response, I guess, is from a class perspective is that you can't really tell the history of class without talking about the history of racial inequality and racial injustice. And there's so many different stories that I could kind of tell along this, but maybe just to repeat one, which is something that happened in the 1970s in the UK. I'm just going to take a sip. So there was
the 1970s was quite kind of a tumultuous time for race relations in the UK. You had the rise of a fascist street movement, but also the rise of a very powerful anti-racist movement to try and combat and suppress their street tactics. And towards the end of the 70s, you had this union struggle happening in London, which was predominantly run by female migrants in a place called the Grumwick Factory, and they were protesting against insecure work and low-paid work. The media dubbed them the strikers in saris. And their strike lasted for 2 years, and at one point all of the British trade union movement got behind the strike, and it was looking to be an incredibly successful win for them, and a real moment of people organising along class lines but from a multiracial perspective. And it was incredibly powerful, and because of that, really, it had to be crushed. And so there was a very, very harsh police repression of the strike, and actually due to that, and also due to kind of other racist ideas within some of the British trade union movement, the British trade unions decided to pull their support from the strike, and it actually ended in defeat. And there's lots of different people basically saying that this was the first domino to fall in the organised labour movement in the UK. So kind of reverting back to what I said at the beginning about those trade union statistics declining, this battle was one of the first points at which you start to see the trade union membership go down. And in a way, it's so symbolic, isn't it? It's to say, because we couldn't organise along different rate, we couldn't build this diverse, multicultural working class movement. That was one of the reasons in which in the 20th century, the organised labour movement has been defeated. So I think that's a really important lesson when we're confronting people like Trump, or those that, or people on the right in the UK, those who use a racialised language to divide the working class. We need to remember from history, if we play into that, we'll only be kind of sowing the seeds of our own defeat in the future.
All right. We have another question from the audience, and that has to do with the context right now in Great Britain. And the question is whether or not you believe Brexit will unsettle or entrench already existing inequalities there.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I haven't actually thought about Brexit in a while, because obviously there's been so much other stuff happening, and it's actually, it's been such a defining part of our politics over the last 4 years. It's almost quite nice to take a little break from it. But will it increase or decrease inequalities? I think it's inevitable that it will increase in inequalities as it's going to play out right now. I mean, I think there could have been a case for an exit position at some point, but at the moment what's happening is Brexit being organised and run by one of the most regressive and reactionary governments that Britain has ever had. I mean, these are people that don't believe in, who from their own reports that they've written before, those who are in power at the moment in the UK, want to undermine the welfare state, want to implement as much free trade deals with a race to the bottom on protections of workers' rights and environmental standards. And I think it's inevitable that will lead to a worsening of class divides in the UK.
We have another question, which is actually a question I had too, and I was debating asking it at the very start of this, but I'm prompted to do so now. And that is, the book. It strikes me that the book, takes a sort of a 40,000-foot view of a lot of these different sort of divides within society, whether we're talking about Great Britain, the United States, or anywhere really in the world. And it feels in many respects like a way to develop a method for thinking about these things with a view ultimately to action. And I'm wondering, and the question is sort of like what made you write this book, and how are you hoping that it's used moving forward?
So I started by writing the book after running a series of workshops in secondary schools on class and inequality. And one of the things to come out of those workshops was the fact that people just didn't really think about class along this capital-labor divide. You know, people had loads of different ways of thinking about class. Some of it was to do with this liberal metropolitan elite versus an old industrial working class. You know, or some people thought of it as this social hierarchy of like an upper class, a middle class, and a lower class, and this hierarchy determining esteem and respect within society. But very, very few young people had a real analysis or understanding, I guess, of capital and labour. And I guess even when we tried to bring it up, it was seen that these terms themselves were like ideological or anachronistic. You know, they weren't relevant for their lives, and this isn't something that people should necessarily think about. So I wanted to write the book to try and give a contemporary narrative to that politics. But in answer to your first question, you know, why? Like, why does capital and labour matter? Why should we think about class like this? I think it's really because of the fact that it's the only way of thinking about class that really has within it our ability to overcome the inequality of class. You know, it doesn't just describe the injustice and the inequalities of the world. Within it understands class not simply as something that divides us, but class as the potential of forming bonds with another person on which to build some kind of movement in order to overcome the division. So, you know, we can look back at history or today of people who are organising, you know, workers and labourers or renters who are organising along with people who are in a similar economic position as them to overcome the inequalities that they face. And I think the central point, I guess, is, okay, if the rich have all of the money and all of the power, where does the power come from for people who are facing the sharp end of these inequalities? And the power comes from our ability to collectively organise, you know, our ability to act as a collective and demand things with the power of a group. That's what I mean about class as like a bond that will enable to make the world more equal and more fair. So let's think about some examples even today within the COVID crisis, because I think maybe this is, you know, as we're all like atomized and on our computers in our own homes, it can be hard to think about what collective struggle can actually look like. But there's so many examples of people organising right now to deal with the economic shocks that are coming. So, for example, in London, there's a group called the London Renters Union. This is organising with renters in the city who are facing the threat of eviction. So what's happened in London, and I imagine in quite a lot of places across the world, is people's incomes have been massively hit, but their rents, they still have to pay their rents. There haven't been any legislation to say, oh, you don't need to pay your rents. And so landlords are really trying to get every last penny out of people, or you know, there's lots of cases of that happening. And so the London Renters Union are organising people, making sure that if landlords are doing that, then there'll be a media campaign to name and shame them, to hopefully let them back down, with the idea that maybe we could start to move towards some kind of collective rent strike, so that as a group, people would, you know, who maybe could pay, would withhold their rent and say, we'll only start to pay our rent when these demands are met, such as we want more council housing built after this crisis, or we want to make sure that nobody's evicted after the crisis because of the debts that they have piled up. And actually, all of the laws that the few laws that do protect us now as renters, a lot of this has come from rent strikes and similar organising in the past. So maybe that's an example along rents. I mean, there's so many other examples that along, particularly around work. I mean, one thing I talk about in the book, which I think is quite nice, and maybe again relates to the COVID stuff happening now, is about work and this idea of work and time. We're all working so much, or maybe a lot of us now don't even have a job. But one of the kind of key things around work and time, I guess, is this idea of the weekend. Where did the weekend come from? Maybe just to revert back to that Warren Buffett thing again. He says, those that make money while they sleep, or those that work till they die. Now, obviously, for a lot of people who are living across the world, we don't work every single day until we're dead. We do have some time off, and one of the key points of the week that we have time off is the 2-day weekend. But even that is something that had to be fought for and won by working class movements in the past. So before, in the mid 19th century in the UK, you only had one day off, Sunday, as instructed by the Bible, and people would basically collectively go and get drunk on Sunday evening, and they would come to Monday morning and they would decide not to go into work as a group. And they actually invented this tradition called Saint Monday, which they mockingly named after a fake saint. And this obviously scared the factory owners and the business people. And in a concession to get rid of Saint Monday, they gave the workers, as a form of legislation, they made it law that they would have Saturday afternoon off. And so it was only through our kind of collective refusal to work, and for the fact that people didn't want to get up on a Monday morning, that we actually now have the weekend.
So we're almost out of time. So I thought we could begin to draw the conversation to a close, and I wanted to put a little finer point on your discussion from just a moment ago and ask you, you've given some examples of sort of issue areas and stuff that's kind of bubbling up during the period of the COVID crisis around organizing, but specifically for, like, if you're speaking to young people, what are some of the things that you tell them about where and how to look to get involved in some of this movement activism? What would you be doing during a moment like this where it feels often like our hands are tied and that our options are limited?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we need to remember that while this time is fundamentally a terrifying and unprecedented time, it also does open up the possibility for wide societal change. There was a poll the other day in the UK that said that only 9% of people want to go back to normal after this crisis. People have seen that society can change in a matter of days. And so when that happens, all of the other crises that we have, the environmental crisis, which I guess is something we haven't really discussed, but I talk about in the book, the crisis around gender, whose work is valued, who has to do the work at home, who has to look after the kids. That has been completely blown open by this public health crisis, because suddenly you have CEOs who never spend any time with their families, haven't been stuck at home and actually connecting with their kids and maybe seeing life from a different perspective. There's also been a huge revaluing of work. What you've got is there's a kind of classic thing that people have repeated for the last 10 years around the fact that people's work isn't necessarily valued by how productive they are, but more about kind of their power in society, which says kind of what would happen if all of the hedge fund managers in the City of London or in Wall Street weren't able to go to work for a few months. What would the impact be on people's lives? And then compare that to what would the impact be if all of the carers and healthcare workers in the economy couldn't go to work. And in the first case, maybe there'd be a case that, if hedge fund managers couldn't go to work, then, the economy might tank. But there could also be maybe an argument to say that maybe people's lives might get slightly better off. In the second case, around carers, the human impact would be catastrophic and undeniably horrendous. And what we see in this crisis is that kind of hypothetical example playing out in reality. What you see is in every single list of who is counted as an essential worker, it includes these jobs like hair work, which is traditionally feminine, which is seen as a kind of traditionally female job, which is incredibly low paid, being the most essential work, while I don't think hedge fund managers or private equity firm managers have made it onto any list of who is defined as an essential worker. So that, there's a real opportunity now, I think, to really make. I don't want to say that this is not. I guess it's an unprecedented time, but it's also it does open up the possibility for change, and so now it's more important than ever, I think, to become politically active. So if you're sitting at home, at the end of the book, I say there's kind of three things that we can do. One of them is take to the streets. So don't do that, because we're not allowed to take to the streets right now. But you can kind of take to the keyboards or whatever, and make your political points. The other one is join a trade union. I really fundamentally say, or a renters union. Get involved in the collective organizations that are based on the work that you do or the places that you live. I think that's so important. It's not, you don't need to join a union and then start to go on strike straight away and get into an argument with your boss. You can join a union and just be updated with what's happening in your industry and what's happening in your workplace. So I'd really recommend that. I think political education is really important as well. Making sure that you're reading, making sure that you're kind of keeping up to date with what's happening, following groups on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, so that when there's naming and shaming of campaigns, as they said about the landlord, you can kind of play your part as well. And I think really, I guess it's also just trying to find hope in the small things that might become possible from this. I saw today, for example, that in Milan, as they start to reopen, they've actually taken over a lot of the city, and instead of car lanes, they've implemented more pedestrianised areas and areas with more cycling, as a way to try and green the economy after this. So even thinking about small things in your local community like that you think might be able to be better, might build a better world as we come out of this is super important. And I guess the last one is this idea of there's so many actions going on, so many mutual, things of mutual aid, people helping their neighbours out, just making sure that your neighbours are okay, making sure that your flatmate's okay, communicating with people, all of these hidden actions of people, I think that we never hear about and won't be written in the history books, but make life better for everyone. We need to kind of also, when things get dark and stuff is dark and stuff is probably going to get darker, we need to remember that humanity has that capacity in it as well.
Ben, thanks so much for giving us your time today. It's been a real pleasure. And just again, for the audience out there, we've been talking with Ben Tippet about his new book, Split, Class Divides Uncovered, out now from Pluto Press, from wherever you get your books these days during COVID lockdown. Ben, thanks again.
I'll show you the book just in case anyone sees it in the well, you won't see it in the bookshelves, but if you see it online, then there it is.
Great. Thanks again, Ben. It's been a real pleasure.
Cool.
Right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Bye.